When I was a little girl growing up in the countryside of Indiana, I used to watch my mama stand in front of the mirror before work. She would take her hairpin out, twist her gray strands into a bun, and smile at herself as if she could see the future. I never understood what she saw back then, but now, looking back, I think she saw strength. She saw a woman who kept going no matter what life threw her way. I guess I inherited that same stubborn hope. My name is Linda, and I am 58 years old. I have one son, Michael, who is 32 now. He works in a big office downtown, and every time I think of him, I still see that little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street and say, "Mama, don't let go, promise you won't ever let go," but somewhere along the way he did. When Michael's father left us, I was 30 years old and terrified. I didn't know how to pay rent, how to raise a child alone, or how to stop crying at night. I worked 2 jobs, one as a school janitor during the day and another cleaning offices at night. I used to come home exhausted, my hands cracked from bleach, my back sore from bending all day, but when I'd see my little boy asleep on the couch with his homework still open, my heart would melt. He was my reason for everything. I'd sit beside him, brush his hair off his forehead and whisper, "You're my pride and joy, honey. You're gonna do big things one day. I just know it." And he did. Michael was smart, ambitious, and determined. He got a scholarship, went to college, and graduated with honors. I remember standing in that crowd at his graduation, clutching my old purse, tears rolling down my cheeks as they called his name. I clapped until my hands hurt when he looked at me from the stage and smiled. I thought, that's it. I did something right in this life. After college, he moved to the city, got a job at a big financial firm, and started living the life I'd always dreamed. He'd have fancy apartment, designer suits, expensive watch. He'd come home on holidays and I'd make his favorite casserole. He'd sit at the table, scrolling through his phone, talking about meetings, deadlines, and clients. I didn't understand half of what he said, but I'd nod proudly anyway. But as years passed, something began to change between us. I started noticing how he'd flinch when I said something too loudly in public, or when I told stories from his childhood. He'd smile politely, but I could see that flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. One day we were at a restaurant when he said softly, "Mom, maybe don't tell people about the time I wet my pants in 3rd grade. Okay, that's kind of personal." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. After that, I tried to be quieter to stay out of the way. But a mother can feel when her child starts to drift away from her. It's like the warmth that once filled the house begins to fade, 1 degree at a time. Then one weekend he called and said, "Mom, we're having a charity event at my office next month. Maybe you could come." I was overjoyed. I asked if I could bring cookies like I always used to. He hesitated and said, "Maybe not this time, Mom. It's kind of a professional setting. You can just come and watch, okay?" I remember that day so clearly. I wore my best blue dress, the one with tiny white flowers on the sleeves. I'd ironed it the night before and polished my old shoes until they shined. I even went to the salon and had my hair trimmed. I wanted to make him proud. When I arrived at the tall glass building downtown, I felt small. The people in the lobby looked like they'd stepped right out of a magazine. Everyone moved fast heels, clicking phones, ringing voices low and confident. I smiled nervously at the receptionist and said, "I'm here for the charity event. My son Michael works here." She gave me a polite smile and said, "Of course, just sign here and take the elevator to the 21st floor." When the doors opened, I saw him across the room, surrounded by his coworkers, laughing, talking. He looked so sharp in his suit, so sure of himself. My heart swelled. I walked up with a small wave and said, "Hi, honey." For a split second, he smiled. Then his expression changed. He looked almost uncomfortable. "Mom, hi, I didn't know you'd be here this early." I said I wanted to help, maybe set up some tables. He scratched the back of his neck, glanced around and said softly, "Maybe just grab a seat over there for now. Okay, we're still organizing." I nodded, trying to ignore the sting in my chest. I sat in a corner quietly watching. As people moved around, setting things up, every now and then someone would glance at me and smile. I smiled back, trying to look useful. At one point, one of his colleagues, a young woman with bright red lipstick, came over and said, "You must be Michael's mother. You look just like him." I beamed with pride and said, "Oh, thank you, honey. Yes, he's my boy. I'm so proud of him." She smiled warmly and said, "He's one of the best people in this office. You raised him well." That made me feel like the whole world had just handed me a gift. But later, when everyone gathered around for introductions, I heard something that cracked my heart just a little. The manager asked everyone to introduce who they'd brought with them. People mentioned friends, spouses, or mentors. When it was Michael's turn, he said lightly, "This is my mom. She's just visiting for the day. She used to work in education." I forced a smile, but inside it hurt because I wasn't just visiting. I was his mother, the woman who had mopped floors and worked nights so he could stand in that very room. During lunch, a few people came up to talk to me. They asked about my life, my work, and I answered honestly. I said I cleaned schools for years and that it was hard but worth it because my son made it. I thought honesty was something to be proud of. But when Michael overheard, he pulled me aside, his voice tight. "Mom, maybe don't tell people that, okay? It's just not the right place." I blinked, confused. "Why not?" I asked. He sighed, "Because it's embarrassing, okay? These people come from different backgrounds, they wouldn't understand." Those words hit me harder than anything ever had I embarrassed him. I wanted to leave right then, but something deep inside told me to stay. I smiled politely and said, "Okay, honey, whatever makes you comfortable." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I sat quietly through the speeches and the laughter, my heart heavy as stone. When it ended, I went home, changed out of my dress, and cried for hours. I wasn't angry, just broken, because I realized that somewhere in his climb up the ladder, he'd forgotten who held it steady for him. But life has a funny way of turning pain into purpose. I decided I wasn't going to let shame define me. I wanted my son to see that dignity doesn't come from titles or money. It comes from the way you treat people and the strength it takes to rise every morning, even when no one claps for you. So I made a plan. That night after Michael's charity event, I sat in my kitchen staring at the cold cup of coffee on the table. I had made it hours ago, but never drank it. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound in the room. The house felt too quiet, too heavy. I kept hearing his words again and again in my mind. "It's embarrassing, okay, embarrassing," I whispered to myself, like the word alone could break me into pieces. How could the same son who used to hold my hand so tight when he was scared now be ashamed of the woman who raised him? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat with a box of old photographs I hadn't opened in years, pictures of Michael in his school uniform, his little hands covered in paint from art class, pictures of us sitting on the porch eating ice cream in summer, pictures of me holding him on his first day of kindergarten. There was one picture of me in my janitor uniform standing outside the school I worked at. My hair was pulled back. I looked tired, but there was a small, proud smile on my face. I remembered that day clearly. I had saved enough to buy him a new backpack, and he had hugged me so tight, saying, "You're the best mom in the world." I ran my fingers over that photo and whispered what happened to that little boy. The next morning, I went to the park to clear my mind. The air was cool and the trees were turning golden. It was fall, my favorite season, because it reminded me that even when things change, they can still be beautiful. I sat on a bench watching people walk their dogs and jog by. A young mother passed with her toddler who was laughing and holding her hand. The sight brought tears to my eyes. An old man sitting on the next bench looked at me kindly and said, "You okay there, miss?" I nodded and said, "Just thinking." He smiled softly. "Thinking's good, long as it don't break your heart." I chuckled a little. He reminded me of my late father. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You know, sometimes folks forget the hands that fed them, but life always has a way of reminding them who really matters." When I got home, I looked around my small house, the same one I had struggled to keep after Michael's father left. Every corner held a memory. The patched sofa, the old curtains, the photo of Michael's graduation hanging crooked on the wall. I walked to the window and whispered, "Maybe it's time I remind him who I am, not with anger but with truth." I knew Michael's company was having another event soon. A big meeting with their clients and staff. It was all over social media. The thought came to me not as revenge, but as something deeper. I wanted him to see me, not as someone to hide, but as the woman who carried him through storms without ever letting go. So I decided to do something different. Over the next few days, I started volunteering at a local shelter downtown. I had always wanted to give back, but never had the time before I met women there who were struggling, just like I once did, single mothers working double shifts, trying to feed their kids. One of them, named Teresa, told me she hadn't slept properly in weeks because she didn't have childcare. I started babysitting her little girl on weekends and helping her fill out job applications. It gave me purpose again. One day, the shelter director asked if I'd speak at a community event about resilience. I hesitated. At first, I wasn't used to talking in front of people. But she said, "Linda, your story could help so many. You've lived through things most can't even imagine." I agreed. I spent nights writing down my journey, not with fancy words, just with truth, how I worked. Nights how I prayed every morning for strength, how love for my son kept me going. The day of the event, I wore the same blue dress from Michael's charity day, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because it made me feel brave. When I stood at that small podium, I looked at the crowd and my hands trembled. But once I started speaking, my fear melted away. I told them about cleaning classrooms while listening to my son's laughter echoing down the hall, about nights when there was barely enough food, but I still left a bigger portion for him. I told them how it feels when your child's pride turns into distance, and how love doesn't fade even when it hurts. I saw people wiping tears from their eyes. One woman came up after and hugged me, saying, "You gave me hope. That moment changed something inside me. I realized my story wasn't something to hide. It was something to share, something powerful." A few weeks later, I got a call from the local paper. They wanted to feature a short piece about my talk. A reporter came to my house, took my photo, and asked what message I'd like to give. I said simply, "Never be ashamed of where you come from. Be proud of the hands that built your tomorrow." The article went viral around town. I didn't think much of it until one day I got a call from a familiar voice. "Mommy," said his tone, low and uncertain. I saw the article. Someone from my office shared it online. I froze for a second, then said, "Oh, well, that's nice, honey. I didn't think anyone would notice." He paused for a long time, then said, "I didn't know you were doing all that volunteer work. That's really good, Mom." For a moment, I thought maybe he'd as starting to understand. But then he added, "Can you please not mention my name in these stories, though? I just don't want people connecting it to my job. It might be awkward." Awkward. That word stung again, but I stayed calm. I said, "Don't worry, honey. I never mentioned your name. You have nothing to be embarrassed about." He said, "Thanks, Mom," then hung up before I could say more. I stared at the phone for a long time. After that, my heart hurt, but something deeper inside me had grown stronger. I realized I wasn't the one who should feel embarrassed. A few days later, I was walking past Michael's office building when I noticed a big banner out front. It said Community and Compassion Week, and I smiled. They were hosting another big event, this time for local charities, including the shelter where I volunteered. The director told me we'd be receiving an award for community service, and she wanted me to accept it on behalf of everyone. I had no idea until that moment that the ceremony would be held right inside Michael's company. When I told her my son worked there, she said, "Oh, wonderful. Maybe he can see how proud you make people." The day of the ceremony arrived. I felt nervous but peaceful. I wore a simple cream dress and my small silver cross necklace that had once belonged to my mother. As I entered the tall building again, the same receptionist from before recognized me. She smiled and said, "Oh, you're back. Good to see you again, Mrs. Parker." I smiled back warmly. "Yes, back again, dear. This time for something a little different." When I stepped out of the elevator onto the 21st floor, memories of that last visit came rushing back. But this time I held my head high. I wasn't there to blend into the corner. I was there to represent women like me who had worked quietly behind the scenes for too long. The room was already full of people in suits and dresses, chatting over coffee trays and brochures. I saw the banner for our shelter on one side and Michael standing across the room in conversation with a few colleagues. He hadn't seen me yet. The director came over, hugged me, and said, "You ready? You're our star today." I smiled nervously. "I don't know about a star, but I'm ready." When the event began, the host took the microphone and said, "Today, we honor those who show us what true courage and compassion look like." People who lift others even when life hasn't been easy for them. One of those people is here with us today. Her story is one of perseverance and love that inspires everyone who hears it. Please welcome Linda Parker. I froze for a second as applause filled the room, then I walked toward the podium, feeling every heartbeat in my chest as I reached the front. I caught sight of Michael. His eyes widened in shock. His hand dropped from his coffee cup, and for a brief second, he just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I smiled at him gently before turning to the audience and began to speak. When I stood at that podium and looked out at the faces in front of me, everything felt still. For a moment I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustling of papers. My hands trembled slightly, but I held onto the edges of the podium and took a deep breath. "Good morning, everyone," I said softly, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. "My name is Linda Parker. I am not someone special, not someone rich or famous. I'm just a woman who worked hard to make sure her child had a chance in life." A quiet hush fell over the room. People who had been checking their phones or whispering now looked up and listened. My son was standing in the back, frozen. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel his eyes on me. I continued. "There was a time in my life when I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. I cleaned classrooms, offices, and sometimes even the very floors people walked on without noticing who scrubbed them. I used to come home with sore hands, cracked skin, and a tired back, but I never comply. Ned, because every time I looked at my son, I knew why I was doing it." Someone in the audience nodded slowly. A woman near the front wiped her eyes. I smiled gently and said, "My story isn't about hardship, it's about love. The kind of love that never gives up, even when people forget where they came from." As I spoke, I could see my past flash before me like old film reels. The nights of overtime, the days when I'd pack peanut butter sandwiches for both of us, the mornings when I'd whisper little prayers before heading to work. I said there were days I felt invisible, like no one saw the woman behind the uniform. But the truth is, every single person who cleans, who serves, who works quietly in the background, they're the ones who keep this world standing. I looked up and met Michael's eyes then. For the first time in years, he didn't look away. When I finished speaking, there was silence for a heartbeat and then applause. Not polite applause, but a wave of clapping that filled the entire room. People stood up. Some even whistled and cheered. I could hardly believe it. The director of the shelter came forward and hugged me tightly. She whispered, "You did it, Linda. You made them feel it." I smiled through tears. As I stepped down from the stage, I caught Michael still standing in the back, his eyes glassy, his jaw trembling just a little. He didn't move, just watched as people surrounded me, shaking my hand, thanking me, calling me an inspiration. When the crowd began to thin out, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around. It was Michael. He looked nervous, his usual confident posture gone. His voice was low. "Mom, can we talk?" I nodded. "Of course, honey." We stepped out into the hallway, away from the noise. For a long moment he said nothing. He just stood there, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to find the right words. Finally he said, "I didn't know." His voice cracked. "I didn't know how hard it really was for you." I gave a soft smile. "I know you didn't, sweetheart. You were just a kid. You weren't supposed to." He looked down, ashamed. "No, I mean, I didn't know you did all that for me. I thought you just wanted to stay in that small town because you didn't have big dreams. I was wrong." I touched his arm gently. "You weren't wrong for dreaming big, Michael. I wanted that for you. But sometimes when we chase the world, we forget the people who gave us the wings to fly." He looked up, his eyes filling with tears. "I embarrassed you, didn't I?" I shook my head slowly. "No, honey. You can't embarrass a mother with success. I was proud of you every step of the way. I just wished you hadn't been ashamed of where you came from." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I told everyone at the office that you were a volunteer speaker, but when you started talking, they figured it out. They all knew you were my mom." I smiled softly. "And what did they say?" He let out a shaky laugh. "They said I'm lucky. One of the managers even said, 'Now we know where you get your strength from.' That made me laugh too. I reached up and touched his cheek like I used to when he was little. 'You always were strong, Michael. You just forgot who taught you that.'" He took my hand and squeezed it tight. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was so stupid. You never embarrassed me. I embarrassed myself." "It's okay," I said quietly. "What matters is that you remembered." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. Then he whispered, "Can you come by the house this weekend?" "I'll cook," I smiled. "That would be nice." We walked back inside together, side by side. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like mother and grown son. It felt like family again. Later, after the ceremony ended and everyone began leaving, a young woman came up to me. She worked at Michael's firm, one of his assistants. She said, "Mrs. Parker, your speech today, it made me call my mom. We hadn't talked in 2 years." I smiled. Tears filling my eyes again. "That's the best thing anyone could have told me, dear." When I left the building that day, the sun was setting. The orange light spilled across the glass doors, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. I got into my car and looked up at the sky. I whispered quietly, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to love, even when it hurt." That night, I sat on my porch, listening to the crickets, sipping a cup of warm tea. It tasted different somehow, sweeter maybe because it was flavored with forgiveness. The next morning, Michael came over, holding a bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers. He looked like a boy again as he handed them to me. I hugged him tightly, feeling the years of distance melt away. We talked for hours that day, about life, about his childhood, about how proud he was now, not of what he had achieved, but of the woman who raised him. "Mom," he said softly, "I told my colleagues today that I used to be ashamed of you, but now I realize you're the reason I have everything I do." They gave me a standing ovation. I smiled through tears. "That's wonderful, honey." He looked at me then and said something I'll never forget. "You didn't just show up at my office, Mom. You showed me who I really am." That evening after Michael left, I sat in the living room long after the lights had gone dim. The smell of the daisies he had brought filled the room, soft and comforting. It was strange how something so small, a simple act of love, could mend such deep cracks in the heart. I looked at the picture on the mantel, the one of him as a little boy holding a baseball bat, his face lit up with laughter, and I smiled. That laughter had always been my favorite sound. The next morning, I went back to the shelter. The women there had seen the photos of the award ceremony posted on social media, and they all hugged me the moment I walked in. "Linda, you're famous now," Teresa teased, smiling brightly. I laughed. "Oh, I don't know about famous, dear. Maybe just a little less invisible." One of the volunteers said, "You made us proud. You made all of us feel seen." And I realized something then. What had started as one mother's pain had turned into a story that belonged to so many. The world was full of mothers who worked quietly, who were forgotten, who were made to feel small. Maybe my voice could help them remember their worth. Over the next few weeks, things changed more than I ever imagined. The local news station called and asked to interview me about the community work. I was nervous, but I said yes. During the interview, the host asked, "What made you start helping others?" I smiled and said, "Because once upon a time, someone helped me believe I was worth more than my struggles. The kind that comes from surviving, from loving, from forgiving." When I entered Michael's office building this time, people smiled at me, not out of pity, but out of respect. Some even came up to shake my hand. I could see pride in Michael's eyes as he introduced me. "Everyone," he said, "this is my mom, the strongest woman I know." I smiled gently and said, "I'm not strong. I just learned how to stand back up every time life tried to knock me down." When I spoke to that room full of employees, I didn't use fancy words. I told them what life had taught me, that kindness matters, that no job is small, that gratitude keeps you human, even when success tempts you to forget. I told them how sometimes the greatest strength is not in fighting the world, but in loving it anyway. When I finished, the entire room stood and clapped, just like before. I looked at Michael and he was clapping the loudest. I could see tears glistening in his eyes, and that alone was worth everything I had ever endured. After that day, something beautiful started happening. Michael began volunteering at the shelter on weekends. At first, he came just to help me, but soon he found himself connecting with people, listening to their stories, realizing how much unseen strength lived in those walls. One night after a shift, he said to me, "Mom, I never understood how much people carry on their shoulders. I used to think success was about money. Now I think it's about meaning." I smiled. That's the kind of success that lasts, son. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between us grew stronger. We started having dinner together every Sunday, just like old times. Sometimes he'd bring his coworkers along, young men and women who wanted to meet the woman who had inspired their boss. They'd sit in my small kitchen, eating my homemade casserole, laughing and talking like family. And every time I looked around that table, my heart felt full. One evening, after everyone left, Michael stayed behind. He looked thoughtful. "Mom, do you ever regret anything?" he asked. I thought for a moment. Maybe I regret being too hard on myself. Maybe I regret not believing I was enough when I was younger. But everything else, even the hard parts, made me who I am. He nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to understand that. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "Mom, I've been thinking about starting a foundation at my company to support single parents trying to go back to school or start small businesses. I want to name it after you." Tears welled in my eyes instantly. "Oh, Michael, you don't have to," he interrupted gently. "I want to. It's the least I can do. You gave me everything. It's time I give something back." And he did. The Linda Parker Foundation for Resilient Families was born just a few months later. At the launch event, they unveiled a plaque with my name engraved in gold letters. I stood there in disbelief, my heart swelling with emotion as applause filled the room once again. Michael looked at me from the stage and said, "My mother taught me that strength doesn't shout, it endures. She's the reason I'm standing here today." I don't think I've ever cried so much in one evening. After the ceremony, as we stood outside under the stars, I hugged Michael tight and whispered, "You made me proud, son." He hugged me back and said, "No, Mom, you made me who I am." That night, as I sat by my window watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I thought about everything that had happened, how one painful moment, being told I was an embarrassment, had turned into a story of healing, love, and redemption. Life has a way of turning full circle when your heart stays kind. The next morning, I went to the shelter again, as I always did. But this time, when I walked through the doors, there was a new plaque on the wall. The foundation had funded new supplies, books, and a small daycare for mothers who needed help. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, and whispered, "Thank you, God. Thank you for turning my pain into purpose." And for the first time in a long time, I felt not just proud, but whole. The day the foundation opened its first family center was one of the proudest moments of my life. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows, and the air buzzed with laughter and hope. There were balloons tied to the doors and a banner that said, "Welcome home." That's what we called the center, the home project. It wasn't just a place to get help. It was a place to start again. As I walked in, people I didn't even know came up and hugged me. Some said, "You're the reason this place exists." Others said, "You gave us hope." But all I could think about was how once upon a time I was the one standing on the other side of that hope. Scared, tired, and lost. Life had come full circle. Michael was on stage that day looking proud and calm. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the microphone. The room went quiet. I smiled and said, "There was a time I thought my story ended in silence. I thought my life was just about surviving one day after another. But sometimes the hardest moments are just the beginning of something beautiful." I looked around at the faces, women holding their children, men trying to rebuild their lives, young people volunteering with bright eyes. "You are not broken," I said softly. "You are being shaped. Every scar you carry tells a story of survival, and that story can light the way for someone else." When I finished, there wasn't a sound, and then came the applause. But more than that, I saw tears and smiles and a feeling in the air that words couldn't describe. After the ceremony, I walked outside to the small garden behind the building. It was quiet there, filled with wildflowers and a bench overlooking a little pond. Michael joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and said, "Remember how you used to sit outside every night with your coffee and dream? Well, look at what you built, Mom." I laughed softly. "I didn't build it alone, sweetheart. You did too. You just didn't know it yet." He looked out at the garden, his expression thoughtful. "I used to think success was having people clap for you," he said. "Now I know success is being able to make someone else smile." I nodded. "That's what love does. It changes what we see as important." For a while we sat in silence, sipping our coffee. The water shimmered under the sun. Birds were singing somewhere nearby. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who scrubbed floors, who felt invisible, who cried into her pillow after long shifts. I wished I could tell her, hold on. One day you'll be proud you never gave up. Weeks later, the foundation began to expand. Michael used his business connections to partner with schools and local companies. They offered scholarships, jobs, and mentorship programs for single parents. Every time I visited, I saw new faces, faces that glowed with hope. But what touched me the most was what Michael did. One Saturday morning, I walked into the shelter to find a group of employees from his firm there, all wearing shirts that said, Team Parker. They were painting walls, sorting food donations, playing with the children. Michael was right in the middle of them, his sleeves rolled up, his face smeared with paint. He looked at me and grinned. Mom, he called out, we're redecorating the kids' corner. We want it to feel like home. I laughed. Oh, you're doing a fine job, honey. You've got more paint on yourself than the walls. Everyone laughed, and in that moment I saw something I'd never seen before. A world where my son's pride and my purpose existed side by side. Later that day, when the work was done, we sat outside on the curb eating pizza straight from the box. Michael looked over and said, Mom, I used to think you embarrassed me, but now I tell everyone you're my hero. Tears filled my eyes. You've always been my heart, I whispered. Time passed and seasons changed. The foundation grew, the shelter thrived. My small house became a meeting place for laughter, friendship, and hope. On Friday nights, I'd host dinners where volunteers and families would come together. Sometimes we'd share stories. Sometimes we'd just sit quietly, grateful to be alive. And every time I looked around my table, I felt the same thing, peace. One evening, long after everyone had gone home, Michael stayed behind again. He looked around the living room, smiling softly. You know, Mom, he said, I think Dad would have been proud of you. I smiled gently, maybe, but I didn't do it for pride. I did it for love. He nodded, yeah, and that's what makes it real. We sat there quietly for a while. The clock ticked softly in the background, and the house felt warm. Before he left that night, Michael stood by the door and said, I love you, Mom. I smiled. I love you too, sweetheart, always. When the door closed, I felt something deep in my chest. Not sadness, not longing, but gratitude. Because life had given me everything I truly needed, love, purpose, and peace. A few months later, the foundation hosted a gala to celebrate 1 year of service. People came from all over. Michael gave a speech, but what he said at the end made me cry all over again. He said, when I was younger, I thought I was teaching my mom about success. But the truth is she was teaching me about life. About kindness, dignity, and forgiveness. Everything I am today I owe to her. So if you ever see me standing tall, know that it's because I'm standing on her shoulders. The room stood up, every single person. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the woman who had once been called an embarrassment. I felt like the woman who had taught her son how to love again. After the gala, a young journalist came up to me and said, Mrs. Parker, people say you changed your son's life. What's your secret? I smiled softly and said, there's no secret, dear. Just love, quiet love, the kind that doesn't give up when it's hurt. That night, when I came home, I lit a small candle by the window, something I always did when I felt grateful. I watched the flame flicker and thought about how far we had come, from the woman scrubbing floors to the woman standing in front of crowds. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the journey. It was every sleepless night, every prayer, every moment of holding on when the world said, let go. Life had tested me, but it also rewarded me, not with riches, but with peace. And that's when I realized forgiveness is not a gift you give someone else. It's a gift you give yourself. Because love doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it just needs to endure. As I looked out at the quiet street that night, I whispered softly to the stars, thank you, Lord, for letting me live long enough to see my child's heart come home. And in that silence, I felt my soul smile. The end.